Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence here means more than you may realize. Every story we share is not just about events or characters. It is about real emotions, real struggles, and the strength it takes to face the truth. In the spring of 2014, in a windscraped little town called Pine Hollow, Wyoming, an 11-year-old girl named Ember Vance was living what looked, from the outside, like the plainest life imaginable. She went to school. She did her chores. She came home to the same small blue house at the end of Larkspur Road, where her parents, Colt and Renata Vance, had raised her since before she could remember. But there was one thing about Ember that never blended into the background, no matter how badly she wanted it to. A jagged line of scar tissue ran from her jaw to just beneath her right eye, silvery and stubborn against her skin. And for as long as she could recall, she had been given the same explanation for it. A propane heater had exploded in their old house when she was barely 2 years old. Her parents had pulled her from the wreckage. She had lived. The house had not. That scar, she was told again and again, was the price of being alive. It was supposed to feel like a badge. Instead, it felt like a leash. Growing up in a town where everybody's business traveled faster than the wind, Ember had learned the hard way that different was not a compliment. Kids at school didn't always say cruel things out loud, but they didn't have to. A too long glance across the cafeteria did the job just fine. Someone would snap a photo at the wrong angle and it would end up circulating before the last bell rang. She got good at angling her face away from cameras. She got good at silence. She got good, in general, at making herself smaller than she was. On a rainy Saturday near the end of April, Ember had an appointment with a specialist 2 hours away in Casper. The same kind of appointment she'd been going to for years, ointments and laser treatments and doctors murmuring about incremental improvement. That morning, before they even left the driveway, she'd worked up the nerve to say what she'd been turning over in her head for weeks. She wanted more than incremental. She wanted it gone. Not someday. Now. She'd seen enough transformation videos online to know that surgery could erase in an afternoon what medicine had been chipping away at for a decade. Her father shut the idea down gently, the way he shut down most things, with a soft voice and an immovable no. Her mother backed him up, insisting there was no reason to rush toward changing a face that was already, in her words, exactly the way it was supposed to be. Ember heard the reassurance. She didn't feel a bit of it. And then, right there at the kitchen table, something in the room shifted. Renata had been flipping through the weekend paper, half listening, when she suddenly went still. It wasn't her usual mild irritation at bad news. It was something Ember had never once seen cross her mother's face. Something closer to dread. The paper folded shut almost violently, tucked away before Ember could get a second look. Nobody explained anything. Her father cleared his throat and asked whether they should get on the road. Her mother mentioned the appointment time twice, as if repetition might erase what had just happened. But it didn't erase anything. It planted itself in Ember's mind like a hook under skin. The drive to Casper wound past a gas station with a newsstand out front. And there, staring back at her from a wire rack, was the very same paper her mother had just hidden. Curiosity got the better of caution. Ember bought a copy and carried it into the waiting room, flipping past the county fair announcements and the letters to the editor without much interest, until she reached a small, easy-to-miss column near the classifieds. A "Have you seen me?" notice. A photograph of a toddler, maybe 2 years old, with copper-red hair and a spray of freckles and eyes the color of wet moss. The girl's name was printed beneath the photo, Juniper Calloway. Missing from a licensed daycare facility in Larkin, Idaho. 12 years earlier. Ember did the math without meaning to. 2 years old in 2002. She herself had been 2 years old in 2002. The numbers lined up with an accuracy that made her stomach drop. The child in the photograph had no scar, no mark of any kind, smooth, unmarked skin, but everything else about her face was unnervingly, impossibly familiar. The slope of the eyebrows, the exact tilt of the eyes. It was like looking at a version of herself that had never been burned. She sat with that unease all through her appointment. When the doctor finished checking her progress and started rattling off his usual notes about continued treatment, Ember asked something she'd never once thought to ask before. If the fire had been bad enough to leave a scar this deep, Why was there nothing anywhere else on her body? No marks on her arms, her hands, her back. Nothing but this one line across her face? The doctor admitted it was an unusual pattern. Not impossible, he said, just unusual. He'd only ever gone on what her parents told him. That answer didn't fix anything. It only widened the crack. By the time the bus dropped her back in Pine Hollow that evening, the whole town looked different to her, like a movie set she was seeing the back of for the first time. She thought about every mile marker on the way home, every gap in the story she'd been told her entire life. If Juniper Calloway had vanished at 2, and Ember Vance had turned 2 the very same year, then the story of a propane explosion in a Wyoming farmhouse needed a second look. She tried hard to recall a single true memory of that night. A smell, a sound, anything, and came up with nothing. No fire recollection. No preschool photographs. Nothing before roughly age 3. When she stepped through the front door, her father asked about her homework like it was any other Saturday. Her mother avoided her eyes a beat too long. Ember watched them both with a new kind of attention, one she hadn't known she possessed until that afternoon. Whatever had frightened her mother in that newspaper, it had something to do with the girl named Juniper Calloway. And for the first time in her 11 years, Ember let herself consider the unthinkable, that the story she'd grown up inside of might not be true at all. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the grainy newsprint photograph, the unscarred face, the copper hair, the number 12 printed beneath it like a countdown. On Sunday morning, she pulled the folded paper back out and read the notice again, slower this time, treating every line like evidence. There was a note near the bottom about the case being kept alive through private effort, and a phone number attached not to any police department, but to a name. Sage Calloway, listed as Juniper's older sister. Ember began laying the facts side by side like puzzle pieces. Age at disappearance, 2. Year 2002. Hair, red. Eyes, green. She mentally superimposed that description onto her own baby photos, the ones that existed anyway, all of which started at age 3, conveniently after any fire, any injury, any evidence of a life before Wyoming. There wasn't a single photo of her as a newborn. Not one hospital bracelet in a scrapbook. Not one home video of a nursery. She'd never noticed the gap before. Now it was the only thing she could see. At breakfast, she studied her parents like she'd never studied them before, watching the practiced rhythm of their small talk, the way her mother steered any conversation away from the previous day's paper with the reflexes of someone who had rehearsed it. She didn't ask a single question out loud. She just watched and stored what she saw. That afternoon, she typed the saved number into her phone and stared at it for a long while before doing anything else. She searched what little she could find online about the Calloway case. Sparse, old articles, a licensed daycare briefly investigated and never charged, a case gone cold, and buried in one older piece, a mention of a suspected trafficking ring that had been operating through parts of Idaho and into eastern Oregon around that same year. The pieces didn't just fit. They clicked. Maybe, she thought, the scar wasn't from a heater explosion in a house that didn't exist. Maybe it came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that happened before there was ever an Ember Vance. That evening, walking home from the corner store, a cluster of kids from the middle school across town recognized her and didn't bother lowering their voices. The usual comments, the usual stares. But this time something in her chest reacted differently. The humiliation barely registered. What she felt instead was urgency. The scar wasn't just something to be ashamed of anymore. It might be the only piece of fissy. At dinner she mentioned, almost too casually, that the doctor had pulled up photos from when she was 3, the earliest ones on file. Her father asked what the doctor had said about her progress. Her mother's eyes locked onto the word photos, like a magnet. It wasn't concern about medicine. It was fear about documentation, and Ember clocked it instantly. Later, alone in her room, she opened the saved contact again. Sage Calloway. 12 years of searching. 12 years of unanswered questions. If Juniper vanished in 2002 and Ember Vance appeared in Wyoming around that very same window, then somebody somewhere had rewritten a life. She drafted a message, careful, non-accusatory, simple. She'd read the notice. Something about it wouldn't leave her alone. Her thumb hovered over the send button far longer than she expected it to. Once she sent it, there'd be no walking it back. But staying quiet felt like agreeing to a lie she hadn't chosen. She sent it. The regret hit almost instantly. What if she was wrong? What if she was about to drag a grieving family through false hope over nothing but a resemblance and a bad feeling? She set the phone face down and lay in the dark, listening to the ordinary hum of her parents' evening routine drifting up through the floor. Everything sounded so normal, and yet she had never felt less certain that normal was real. By Monday, the quiet inside her own house had started to feel louder than any conversation. The message to Sage sat unanswered through the night and into the morning, and every buzz of her phone sent a jolt through her chest that collapsed into disappointment when it turned out to be nothing. She told herself adults had reasons to be slow. The waiting gnawed at her anyway. At school, she noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. How easily her classmates rattled off memories from when they were toddlers, first apartments, preschool teachers, family road trips. She realized she had none of that. Every early memory she owned had been handed to her secondhand, told and retold by Colt and Renata until it wore the shape of truth. That evening she found that the Larkin, Idaho daycare had shut its doors in late 2002 after an investigation into falsified staff records. Her phone buzzed close to 9 that night. A reply from Sage. Careful, restrained urgency. Who was she? How had she found the notice? Ember answered honestly. 11 years old, living in Wyoming, red hair, green eyes, found the paper completely by accident. Sage asked for a photo. Ember hesitated, then sent her school portrait. Minutes later, the resemblance was overwhelming. Then a question, Ember's exact birth date. April 2000. Juniper had been born in April 2002. Sage explained that both girls had been placed in the daycare turn shelter after being left there as toddlers, with no confirmed biological family ever coming forward. Sage had been 8 when her sister disappeared, and remembered a small gap between her front teeth, a strawberry-shaped birthmark near her collarbone. Ember didn't have a birthmark like that. She had a scar instead and described it along with the story of the heater explosion attached to it. Sage's response detonated everything. There had been a fire, she said, but not in a house. A warehouse fire, tied to the trafficking investigation from that same year, in late 2002. Investigators believed several children had been moved through unofficial channels before the operation was broken up. Sage had spent over a decade piecing together whatever she could find, refusing to accept that her sister had simply vanished into nothing. A warehouse fire, not a house fire. Similar enough that a 2-year-old might confuse the two if that's what she'd been told her whole life. Different enough that the distortion could only have been deliberate. Ember searched property records for anything tied to her family's name before they bought the house on Larkspur Road. Nothing existed before early 2003. At dinner, she tested the story gently, asking what town their old house had been in before it burned. Her father gave a vague answer about somewhere outside Cheyenne. Her mother changed the subject before he even finished the sentence. Later that night, Sage told her she'd been placing that same classified notice every single year on Juniper's birthday since she turned 18, working 2 jobs just to keep affording it, never once letting herself believe her sister was gone for good. Something unfamiliar rose up in Ember when she read that. Not fear, but recognition. Somebody out there had spent 12 years refusing to give up on her. Before signing off, Sage gently asked whether Ember would be willing to talk to police or consent to a DNA test just to know for certain. No pressure, just clarity if Ember wanted it. Ember stared at that message for a long time. Saying yes meant blowing her entire life open, but staying quiet meant protecting a lie. She typed back that she was willing to find out the truth. Downstairs, her parents' evening carried on exactly as it always had. But nothing was the same anymore. The scar that had always meant survivor now felt like the opening line of a story she'd never been told the rest of. Tuesday brought a strange, humming tension that followed her everywhere. Overnight, Sage had sent scanned copies of the original 2002 missing child report, along with notes about the broader trafficking investigation that had swept through Idaho and into the Pacific Northwest that year. A warehouse fire had disrupted part of the operation. Several children had been recovered afterward. Others had never been accounted for. Juniper Calloway remained, on paper, unresolved. Ember's birth year lined up too cleanly to be coincidence. At dinner that night, she brought up the old insurance claim from the supposed house fire, framing it as research for a school project. Her father stumbled through an answer about lost paperwork. Her mother added something about not wanting to revisit painful memories. The vagueness that had always sounded like grief now sounded like something rehearsed. Sage messaged again that evening, asking if Ember had told her parents anything. She hadn't. Sage said she planned to go to Idaho State Police the next morning with everything she had, and asked if Ember would be willing to confirm her identity and location if officers reached out. Ember said yes, even though every part of her understood what that yes would trigger. The following days blurred into a low, constant hum of surveillance disguised as concern. Her father came home early. Her mother asked more questions about school than usual, hovered longer than usual, watched her a little too closely. They knew something had shifted, even if they didn't know exactly what. On Wednesday, Sage confirmed that Idaho authorities were now involved, and that the case would soon be looped in with officials closer to Ember. She promised nothing would happen without careful verification and that Ember's safety came first. That word, safety, sat heavy in Ember's chest for the rest of the night. While going through an old desk drawer that evening, she found something she'd never noticed before. Her own amended birth certificate. It listed Pine Hollow, Wyoming as her birthplace, dated April 2000. But the registration stamp on the document read early 2003, nearly 3 years after the birth it claimed to record. She photographed it and sent it straight to Sage, who responded fast. A delay like that usually pointed to adoption paperwork or something altered after the fact. By Thursday, her parents' attentiveness had curdled into something closer to control. Her mother asked twice whether she'd been spending more time online than usual. Her father made an offhand comment about how dangerous strangers on the internet could be. That night, Sage sent an urgent message. Investigators had located an old surveillance still from the 2002 warehouse fire, a red-haired toddler being carried out of the building, her face partially visible and visibly severely burned. Before Ember could even process it, her name was called from downstairs. Her parents were standing in the living room, the same newspaper spread open on the coffee table. The missing child notice circled in pen. Her father's face wasn't confused. It was afraid. He asked point-blank if she'd contacted anyone. Her mother's composure cracked at the edges, insisting the internet twisted people's imaginations. Ember didn't confess to anything. She didn't have to. The fear in the room said enough on its own. That night's final message from Sage delivered the last piece of pressure. Authorities intended to make contact within 48 hours. Friday morning, her father announced, out of nowhere, that he was taking the day off. Her mother canceled an appointment. Family time, they called it. Ember understood exactly what it really was. Friday evening arrived wrapped in a calm that felt manufactured rather than earned. Her mother hovered, offered to watch a movie together, asked twice if she needed help with homework. Small, ordinary gestures stacked a little too high, like a wall built out of normalcy. Late that afternoon she mentioned she was sleeping over at a friend's for the long weekend. Her father hesitated a beat too long before agreeing to drive her. Her mother handed her a glass of water before she left, warm, almost tender. She drank it in the car. Within minutes, a heaviness settled over her that had nothing to do with a long week. The turns didn't match the route to her friend's house. Streetlights thinned out. Landmarks disappeared. Then, nothing. When awareness came back, it arrived in pieces. Her parents were there, faces carefully arranged into concern, explaining that they'd decided on a spontaneous little family trip, that she'd fallen asleep in the car and they hadn't wanted to wake her. But her mind was already sharper than they expected. She remembered the water. She remembered the wrong turns. She remembered the fear rising right before the dark swallowed everything. There was no other explanation. She'd been drugged. She said so plainly. Her father denied it. Her mother called it exhaustion, imagination, stress. Ember pushed past the denials and said the two names that mattered: Juniper Calloway. Sage. The messages. The birth certificate. Whatever performance they'd been keeping up finally gave way. Her father admitted they knew she'd seen the article. Ember kept pressing. Why the altered route? Why she'd woken up somewhere unfamiliar? Why the birth certificate showed a registration date that made no sense? The answers stopped being about denial and started being about damage control. Her father said, quietly, that some truths could destroy a family for no good reason. Her mother argued that reopening the past would drag law enforcement into something long since settled. Ember told them plainly she intended to talk to the police. Her father's composure broke first. He admitted that if police got involved, she could end up in the foster system while everything got sorted out. Her mother's voice cracked into something closer to pleading, talking about the love they'd given her, the stability, the years of birthdays and school events, insisting that a family was built through commitment, not paperwork. Ember listened to all of it, but something had already changed in her permanently. Slowly, the confession unspooled. Years of failed fertility treatments had worn her parents down. Through what her father called a private connection, they'd been introduced to people who promised a faster, quieter path to a child than the official adoption system could offer. He admitted the paperwork had come together after the fact, not before. Her mother filled in what he wouldn't say outright. They'd traveled out of state in the fall of 2002. There had been unrest at the property where they picked her up. Rumors that investigators were closing in on the operation. In the chaos, a warehouse used for storage caught fire. The child who would grow up to be called Ember Vance had been inside it. She'd suffered burns down the left side of her face. Her parents claimed the people running the operation had considered simply abandoning injured children rather than risk drawing medical attention. That, her father said, was the moment they decided to step in, to take her, to save her. Ember asked one simple question. Had they called the police then or ever? The answer was no. Instead, they'd driven home, secured falsified paperwork through the same network, filed a delayed birth certificate in early 2003, and quietly rewritten a warehouse fire in Idaho into a heater explosion in Wyoming. Repetition had done the rest, smoothing the lie until it felt unshakable, even to them. Her mother admitted she checked missing persons databases in the early years, quietly, alone, and told herself that since there was no media storm, no one was actively searching. That belief held until Sage turned 18 and started paying for that notice every single year, patient and unrelenting, until the year the story finally reached the one person it needed to. Her father pivoted to fear again, warning that going to the police now would erase everything. Ember answered him without flinching. Whatever legal danger they were in now was the direct result of choices they'd made. She acknowledged that stepping in during the fire may have kept her from further harm in the moment. That didn't undo the fact that they'd erased her name without ever asking her. Her phone buzzed. Sage. State police had confirmed the coordination and a welfare check was likely within 12 hours. Ember read it out loud. Her father closed his eyes. He asked her to hold off on saying anything formal until they could talk to a lawyer. Ember thought it through, calmly, and told them she would tell any investigator the truth, plainly, whenever they asked. The moment that confession finished, whatever fragile calm remained inside that camper dissolved into panic. Her parents whispered about needing time to think, about gathering themselves before facing anyone official. Ember recognized the shift immediately. Cooperation had quietly become an excuse to stall. A knock at the door cut through everything. A campground manager, checking in, nothing more. But the arrival of an outsider broke the isolation her parents had built around her. And Ember didn't waste the opening. She reached the door first and said, plainly, that she'd been brought there without her consent, that she believed her identity had been falsified years ago, and that law enforcement already knew about it. The silence that followed was absolute. Her parents didn't try to spin a new story in front of a stranger. Instead, they ran, slipping past her into the tree line before anyone could stop them. The campground manager called it in immediately. Within minutes, officers arrived, and Ember told them everything, start to finish. The newspaper, the resemblance, the delayed birth certificate, the drugged water, the confession, all of it, calmly and without exaggeration. Officers confirmed that Idaho investigators had already been coordinating that same afternoon, matching Sage's last message almost to the minute. Search teams moved into the woods. Within a couple of hours, her parents were found and taken into custody without a struggle, transported separately for questioning. Ember was brought to the station in a different vehicle, a juvenile welfare officer staying beside her the entire time. At the station, she gave a full statement. Investigators pulled the birth certificate she'd photographed and requested the official county records to compare against it. The discrepancies matched what she'd already found. No hospital record anywhere for a birth under that name at that date. Idaho police shared their archived files on the Calloway case before midnight, and for the first time, the two threads of the investigation, 12 years and hundreds of miles apart, met in the middle. Under separate questioning, her parents' stories diverged just enough to matter. One leaned on the language of rescue. The other leaned on desperation. Both admitted to using an unlicensed network to arrange the placement. Both admitted the documents had been falsified. Neither denied crossing state lines with a child in the fall of 2002. By early morning, Sage had been contacted directly. She was told a minor matched multiple identifiers connected to her sister's case and was asked if she could travel out immediately for identification and DNA testing. She said yes before the officer had even finished the sentence. Sitting in protective custody as the sky lightened outside, Ember tried to hold two truths at once. Her parents were no longer her legal guardians. And yet 12 years of shared holidays and quiet routines didn't just disappear because a document turned out to be false. She didn't know yet how to carry both of those facts. She only knew she had to. Sage arrived before noon. 4 years she'd existed to Ember only as a name under a classified ad, then as a voice through a screen. Now she was standing in the same building, and the resemblance between them didn't need any lab result to confirm it. The same red hair, the same green eyes, the same set to the cheekbones, softened and reshaped by 12 very different years but unmistakably, undeniably shared. Guided by investigators who needed the interview documented properly, Sage spoke carefully. She confirmed her own birth date. She confirmed Juniper's. She described growing up together at the shelter after they were both left there as toddlers, described taking on a caretaker role for her little sister even at 8 years old, described the day Juniper simply wasn't there anymore, and the years of searching that followed. When the technician came in with the swabs, neither girl hesitated. While they waited on results, Ember learned more about her earliest years in that one afternoon than she had in her entire life up to that point. Sage remembered a stuffed rabbit Juniper refused to sleep without, the faint dusting of freckles, a certain stubbornness about vegetables. Ember didn't remember any of it herself, but being remembered, she found, carried its own kind of weight. The results came back with a probability of sibling relation above 99.9%. The name Ember Vance was formally set aside. Juniper Calloway was reinstated in every legal record that mattered. Child welfare services in both states moved fast. Sage, now 18 and legally independent, offered to take temporary guardianship, arriving with employment records and references already prepared, as if she'd been quietly getting ready for this exact moment for years. Within 48 hours, emergency guardianship was granted, pending a final court hearing. Her parents were formally charged: kidnapping, custodial interference, document fraud, and conspiracy tied to a trafficking case that had never fully closed. Arraignment followed within the week, bail granted alongside a strict no-contact order. The legal timeline moved quickly. The emotional one didn't move at all in step with it. As Juniper packed to relocate to Idaho, she found herself caught between grief and relief, sometimes both in the same breath. Colt and Renata had lied. They had built a false identity around her and drugged her rather than let the truth surface on its own terms. But they had also shown up to every school conference, paid for years of treatment on a scar they'd caused the story of, celebrated every birthday like it mattered. She didn't forgive the deception. She also couldn't pretend those years hadn't happened. Sage never pushed. She gave her sister room to be angry, to grieve, to feel unsure, without demanding an instant bond neither of them had earned yet. Juniper started at a new school in Idaho that fall. Counseling was arranged through a state program built for survivors of trafficking. The old warehouse fire case reopened in full, now with a living witness attached to it, and federal investigators stepped in soon after. Eventually, both parents accepted plea deals, acknowledging the falsified documents and the unlawful transport across state lines. The court noted they hadn't physically abused her and had provided genuine care, but the weight of the fraud and kidnapping charges stood regardless. Juniper attended one hearing. She listened to the outcome, heard the acknowledgement that whatever their original intentions, they had taken a decade of her true identity from her. She felt love and violation sitting in the exact same space, and didn't try to force one to cancel out the other. She chose not to approach them afterward. Peace, she was learning, didn't require a final confrontation. By the end of that year, her name was fully restored across every record that mattered: school files, medical charts, the works. The scar was finally, officially, tied to the truth. A warehouse fire in Idaho, not an invented accident in Wyoming. Sage settled into the role of guardian with more steadiness than anyone had a right to expect from someone barely out of her teens, juggling work and court dates and every meeting child services required. And Juniper began, slowly, to build her own version of the story. Reading the original case file, studying that same photograph that had run every year on her birthday, learning exactly how much of Sage's paycheck had gone, year after year, into keeping her name alive in print. The scar didn't disappear, but it stopped meaning something to hide. It became proof instead, of a fire she'd survived, and of a sister who had simply refused to stop looking. Life afterward wasn't simple. There were more court dates. There was therapy. There were strange, small moments, explaining to a new teacher why her 18-year-old sister was the one signing her permission slips. There was grief for the parents who raised her, sitting right alongside gratitude for the sister who found her. Both were allowed to exist at once. Years on, when someone asked about the scar, she stopped reaching for the old story about a heater and a house that never existed. She told the truth she'd finally made peace with, a story about resilience, about love that was real even when it was tangled up with something wrong, about the difference between protecting someone and simply keeping them. Identity, she came to understand, isn't only about who raises you, and it isn't only about blood either. It's built from truth, from accountability, and from the nerve it takes to look directly at whatever's been hidden. Her parents' choices had grown out of longing and fear. Her sisters had grown out of loyalty that never once ran out. And Juniper had landed somewhere in the middle of both, left to decide for herself what she'd carry forward. In the end, it wasn't the lie that defined her, and it wasn't the crime either. It was the choice she made the moment the truth was finally in front of her, to face it instead of look away. She chose honesty over comfort. She chose to write her own story instead of living quietly inside someone else's. And in doing that, she proved something worth remembering. Love that starts in a broken place can still be real, but it only survives long-term if it's finally, eventually, built on the truth. The scar stayed, so did the truth behind it. And together, they became the foundation of a life that finally, fully, belonged to her. If this story moved you in any way, we'd be so grateful for your support. A like, a comment sharing your thoughts, a subscribe to keep more stories like this one coming. It all helps this reach the people who might need it most. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next story.